So we have Dave McCormick joining us. Dave is a PhD candidate in the Yale Department of Anthropology and a museum assistant at the Peabody Museum's Anthropology Division. Using obsidian as a lens, his work is concentrated on how patterns of trade and craft production can be used to reconstruct political and economic systems in pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica. His talk today will discuss purposeful deposition of artifacts, which give us clues to the activities of ancient artisans and the role they played in pre-Hispanic society on the Pacific coast of Guatemala. And so with that, I will pass it off to Dave.
As the saying goes, one man's rubbish may be another man's treasure. And for those who study people, it's treasure. People have always generated rubbish, trash, garbage, waste, you pick your term. Trash, in a sense, is a material record of the activities and choices people make and can be used to answer many questions like, who made this trash? What is it before it was trash? How was it used? When was it manufactured? And when did it become trash? Where did it come from? Why did these objects end up in the trash? Are they broken, used up, or worn out? What people throw away and how they do it says a lot about human behavior. Modern society has both formal and informal industries that are dedicated to trash, like waste management and professional dumpster divers who reuse, refurbish, or recycle trash. Both police and private investigators routinely use trash to gather evidence in building court cases, while criminals can use it to gather personal information and commit things like identity fraud. In either case, trash holds the details of people's lives. Archaeologists study trash for the same reasons, to find out how ancient people lived. Although we can rarely achieve the resolution of a particular individual's action through trash, the way modern forensics can, it can help us reconstruct the activity patterns of people at different scales. A privy or an old well often served as an out-of-the-way place for people to dispose of old household items and tells us a lot about a household group or a group of households over a generation or a longer period of time. Special pits to deposit trash might be dug out to dispose of waste produced during a single event, like a feast, as we see here in reconstruction of Stonehenge and an excavation showing a bunch of pig bones in a pit. And it's often used to identify specialized areas like workshops with waste generated by them. And here we see a kiln on the top. We see a kiln in Sicily and pottery wasters generated in that kiln. My dissertation is concentrated on reconstructing socioeconomic patterns at Coatzamalguapa, an archaeological site in Guatemala. During the late Classic, about 650 to 1000 of the Common Era, Coatzamalguapa was a major city well known for its magnificent sculptural corpus. In a world without metallurgy, stone tools were critical to life during this period. Since the local geology did not provide it, almost all cutting edges at Coatzamalguapa were made of imported obsidian, coming from the Guatemalan highlands, seen here as red stars. And here is Coatzamalguapa, here on the Pacific coast of Guatemala. And all their cutting edges came from these stars in the Guatemalan highlands. And the most important circulating obsidian sources during this period were here, San Martin, Jilotepeque, El Chayal, which is near modern Guatemala City, and Ixtepeque, close to the Salvadorian border. Obsidian presented the ideal lens into reconstructing socioeconomics at Coatzamalguapa for several reasons. Obsidian can be geochemically sourced, making it ideal for reconstructing patterns of trade and exchange. And the manufacture of obsidian tools is a reductive technique, which by nature produces diagnostic waste that is indicative of particular industries. In this case, in the case of Coatzamalguapa, the two major industries are prismatic blades and projectile points. So it tells us about what is happening, how it arrived, where, and we can see where it's coming from, and we can see through other artifacts around the area, what else is happening there. So we have a number of testable hypotheses that we can look at when we are looking at obsidian. We can see through geochemical, how is the obsidian procured? Did the workshops that are making this obsidian rely on centralized authority? Were the workshops independent, or did they rely on middlemen, agents, and merchants? How specialized were these workshops? And we can tell that again by the waste or debitage. Did certain workshops specialize in a particular industry? And if so, which ones? Did the workshops engage in other activities, which can be seen by other associated artifacts? How was obsidian consumed throughout Coatzamalguapa? Did a central authority redistribute obsidian tools? Particular workshops provision particular parts of the city or neighborhoods? Or did consumers rely on an open market to obtain obsidian? And additional questions are, when was it happening? That we can see through the excavation. When was this happening, and who was involved in making it? Information from the debitage and within these trash pits of finished tools demonstrates that these two major obsidian industries were present at Coatzamalguapa. And those include prismatic blades, seen here, and here's the reduction sequence and what the materials it produces. What we see here at the bottom are these prismatic blades. These are error corrections, and these are here are cores. This represented this here, the kind of end product. So these all end up in the trash. These end up in the trash, and also where we also in consumption contexts. And here we see bifaces, nice pretty drawings of them, and also projectile points that we see, broken ones thrown out in the trash, and the trash that we'd expect to see generated, and we see it here in the archaeological record. The diagnostic debitage recovered from these dumps tells us that in all cases except one, both of these industries were being practiced, and that only one, and in one case that we have a workshop making only blades, because no thinning flakes, these guys over here, or broken projectiles were found in the trash pit. Geochemical data was generated using portable X-ray fluorescence, a portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. This technique works by measuring concentrations of a suite of elements by using the use of primary X-rays. Elemental data are gathered when primary X-rays displace electrons from inner orbits of surface atoms, which are subsequently filled with electrons from outer orbits, releasing energy in the form of a secondary X-ray or fluorescent X-rays that are recognized by a detector. Since the relationship between the emission wavelength and atomic number is known, isolation of characteristic lines allow for unique identification of an element. The concentrations of these elements gathered on artifacts are compared to known sources. So basically, we put an artifact here on the X-ray gun, essentially. It shoots X-rays into the artifact, which then displace electrons. These wavelengths tell us conducted on these materials, tell us where these are coming from on the map, so we can trace them right back to their origin. A comparison of data gathered on known sources from Guatemalan obsidian and material gathered from these workshops shows that two of these dumps primarily relied on material from the El Chayal obsidian source near modern-day Guatemala City. While dump D and G obtained just over half and about 70% of their obsidian from San Martin, Jilotepeque, respectively. The presence of several San Bartolome bifacial thinning flakes from dump A indicate likely a single biface was produced from material from this source, which is a unique case as far as I know. People didn't generally use San Bartolome obsidian to make tools of any kind. Importantly, San Martin Jilotepeque material found at dump A and Ixtepeque material found at dump F consist of only blades, suggesting that these blades were not produced at the dumps, but procured from another workshop or imported as finished products. Looking at Coatzamalguapa as a whole, we see that the city and sites in its hinterland are engaging in exchange of two primary sources, El Chayal and San Martin Jilotepeque, and that several other obsidian sources are trickling in at low levels. The lack of production evidence from these sources, except in the case of San Bartolome thinning flakes, suggests that most obsidian, not from the aforementioned sources, was imported as finished products. So basically that most obsidian that isn't El Chayal or San Martin Jilotepeque found throughout these sites are being imported as finished tools. The presence of San Bartolome obsidian is significant as it points to close ties with the Antigua Valley, where Coatzamalguapa sculpture has been found. And the Antigua Valley would be just going straight north if you take even a modern road from Coatzamalguapa past the site of Los Sujuyes up this way towards the Guatemalan highlands, you will get to the source of San Bartolome Milpas Altas. It's the first one you'll arrive at. It appears that although access to finished tools was not restricted at Coatzamalguapa and its hinterland, the raw materials and perhaps the knowledge of how to produce these materials was. And based on evidence, Coatzamalguapa's obsidian dumps, the artisans were of high status and engaged in more than just obsidian tool production, in some cases. Buried within and adjacent to the dumps of Coatzamalguapa are a number of diagnostic artifacts that tell us about just what was happening there. Dump D, located on a rocky promontory near the El Baúl Acropolis, was not suitable for habitation, but areas just south show a great deal of architecture here. So here's the dump here, up here, and here's the large architectural compound. The architectural compound just south of dump D uncovered a sweat bath and a number of cached vessels with some with prismatic blades which had been placed inside of them. These are interpreted as ritual offerings which occurred within the site of a major obsidian dump, but not at it. In contrast to dump D, the majority of ceramics recovered around from dump A and from around dump A and its associated architecture were found within the dump itself. Many of these were high quality servingwares and plates, suggesting the people who made the dump were of an upper class. Here you see some beautiful vessels and nacarinas found within the dump. Dump A, and here's patio 1 associated with dump A. And it's within dump A and its associated architecture, a number of other artifacts were recovered. So those small ocarinas that I showed you on the last slide, figurines and figurine molds, as well as grinding stones and spindle whorls, suggest all of these together basically suggest a domestic setting where the household activities of food preparation and serving were undertaken side by side with the production for exchange of obsidian tools and possibly textiles. Similarly, at dump F, vessels were deposited within the dump itself and artifacts were recovered within the adjacent structures, which point to the production of food and textiles. Additionally, the recovery of bark beaters also suggests the production of paper. Here's bark beaters, and here's another one, which should also be used for smoothing materials. And we also have at Dump F, they're producing what we call donut stones, a kind of a class that's been a class of artifacts that's been suggested as being related to textile production, although we're not exactly sure. But at any rate, the production of artifacts in pumice is, as far as I know, a unique occurrence. We have also recovered significant amounts of carbon from these workshops, which have been able to tell us when exactly these workshops were in operation. Now, although everything occurs in a modern sugarcane field and we have a lot of disturbance happening, these radiocarbon dates from lower layers within the excavations can tell us that minimally at workshop A, we have an operation. So we have 2 dates from workshop A, one at about a meter and change below, and then one at a little deeper below a sealed floor. Tell us that this workshop was in operation for at least or close to 200 years. At workshop F, we have a much thinner deposit, so we were only able to get one date that we were, one sample that we were confident to use, and that showed us that it is contemporary, puts a date about in the middle of the operation of contemporary with workshop A. And workshop E, we had a nice sealed deposit up here where we can say that that workshop was sealed with a floor above it much earlier than the operation of either of these other 2, which is interesting in and of itself. And basically would date to the very founding of the city. So we're able to answer a lot of these research questions of what of socioeconomics and exchange and craft production with Obsidian, which told us that we have workshops operating independently of a centralized authority because we have different Obsidian signatures at different workshops. And those are mostly El Chayal and San Martin Jilotepeque, but also include that one workshop, workshop A, with using San Bartolome obsidian to produce bifaces, probably at least one biface. Workshop A is producing projectiles from that unique source. 3 of the 4 workshops are engaged in the production of blades and projectiles. Workshop G is producing only blades, interestingly. Consumers obtained obsidian through networks that included Cotamalwapa workshops and possibly imported finished products, including obsidian from Ixtepeque, Laguna Ayarza, and Tajumulco. And Tajumulco is that source all the way by the Mexican border. Associated artifacts are telling us that workshops A and F have evidence of engagement in domestic activities alongside obsidian production, which indicates a domestic workshop. Workshop D shows little evidence of domestic activity, so that we think is a specialized workshop. And while the ceramics altogether suggest a mid to late classic date, our carbon dates are able to refine that chronology significantly. Economics activities at workshop A also include textile and figurine production, and economic activities at workshop F also include textile and paper production. Workshop F also is engaging in the artifacts made of pumice, which is a unique occurrence as far as I'm aware. So I'd like to acknowledge many people and funding providers who collaborated on this and assisted this work, especially the Rust Foundation, who made a lot of the analyses possible, the Macmillan Center, who helped with an international dissertation fellowship, Yale University's Smith Fund and Albers Travel Fund, the Institute of Guatemala in Guatemala of Anthropology and History, who without this would not, without their collaboration, this would not have been possible. Several people at in Guatemala, especially Edgar Carpio, Leonel and Enrique Urizar, Hector Mejia, and all the field and lab crew from the Colonia Maya and Siquinala, Dr. Zach Ruby, and collaborators Lindsay Powell and Courtney Powell from the University of Northern Kentucky, my advisor, my advisors, I should say, and all the people who collaborated with me here at Yale University and those at Lehman College in New York, and my unaffiliated helpers, folks that had collaborated with me, helping me out doing drawings and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. That was a really interesting presentation. I just want to say congratulations on all the work that you've been able to complete during your time here at Yale.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So I was wondering, first off, I saw a couple of vessels in one of the slides, and that was really interesting to me. Could you tell me a little bit more about like what those vessels? You mentioned some ritual purposes.
Sure. So there's those vessels that we believe are ritually cached, kind of in the associated architectural group at Dump or Workshop D. Those are clearly purposefully cached vessels. They're below living surfaces, and they have the obsidian blades found in them. So there, we believe those are a ritual purpose. Possibly they were offerings left, and those blades would have possibly been used in bloodletting rituals, where people were doing auto sacrifice, basically bleeding themselves, and then depositing either the blood itself or blood on paper, and then into those vessels with then the blade itself. And then we also find the vessels within the dumps themselves, not at Workshop D, noticeably, but in Workshops A and F, and in Workshop E, which I didn't show slides of. But those vessels are probably part also of ritual disposal or purposeful disposal of maybe activities of feasting, which may, you can, see that as has a ritual element to it as well.
Sure. Thanks. And then I was wondering, this is a little bit of a, I guess, like maybe methods question or like a when you're in the field question, but how do you tell a trash deposit from like a storage location?
Oh, that's a good question. For a trash deposit, and one of the things that I forgot to mention, and I had it in my notes, was the reason that you have to get rid of obsidian trash, of course, is because basically obsidian it's glass, it's volcanic glass, and it's dangerous, essentially. So as production refuse needs to be removed from living surfaces, otherwise you're literally going to cut yourself to ribbons. And having worked with obsidian a lot, I can attest to that. But basically, you can tell trash from a storage deposit because it has a lot of the things that you basically don't want. Vessels will be, instead of being intact, they'll be broken. You'll have like the diagnostic debitage as opposed to, say, a bundle of blades that would still be usable. So you're going to find broken blades, basically the waste materials, those thinning flakes, basically production errors and that sort of thing. Those are going to be in the trash, along with broken grinding stones, broken other broken tools, right, that you no longer have any use for. Whereas in the storage context, you're going to find things like preserved vessels that may or may not still contain food, and tools that are still usable or unused, right?
Nice. Cool. Thank you. I have one question here that says, do you anticipate that in 1,000 years, people will be performing similar analyses on 21st century landfills?
Well, the major issue with that is that I mentioned in the earlier that we have like sort of a modern infrastructure now that deals with trash, which even up until very recently, people would throw their trash away maybe in a special place, but much closer to where it was being produced, like the privy I showed in one of those one of the first slides. So I do think ultimately that these large landfills will be the subject of study, because they will tell us a lot about the trash, or the kind of consumption habits of, say, a city or a group of municipalities that all use the same dump. But you won't get they won't have the same kind of resolution that you get, say, from an individual's trash can on trash day, or that we're getting from these middens, even though these middens might have been used for 100 years, right? These ancient trash pits. So I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but I think that they will be the subject of study, but they're not going to be the same. You're not going to be able to answer, ask or answer the same questions with that kind of info.
Because you have those sites that you were comparing, and then what you're saying is we wouldn't be able to do those like site comparisons because it all just gets conglomerated into a big like city trash deposit, right?
But if you have a situation where, let's say people were using, not using that infrastructure to get rid of their trash, which still happens, right? I mean, all you have to do is drive on the highway or on any road, and you'll find that people have dumped their trash, right, somewhere. And that will tell us, littering can tell, you can answer a lot of questions by littering, like what are people getting rid of that they don't, in places that they don't want to go into that circulation. So there's going to be other questions that I think researchers will be asking later on.
Cool. And then I have a couple of related questions here. One of them is kind of specific. Are the blades, so the obsidian blades, commonplace artifacts? So are those used by people of different socioeconomic classes? And then a more general question about like the connection between the ceramics and the different type of pieces that you found and what that means about the status of those communities.
Right. So blades, the prismatic blades that I showed, so I think they were on the left side of the screen. Those are the ubiquitous Swiss Army knife of Mesoamerica. Everyone uses them, regardless of socioeconomic status. Now, rich people might have access to more of them and go through more of them more often. But everyone has access to obsidian blades, regardless of status. Projectile points, not so much. Those would have been more restricted in distribution and in use. I should also mention that making prismatic blades produces very little waste, whereas producing projectile points produces a lot of waste. So there's also a relationship with what's economical and basically what costs less to make, right? So a projectile point costs a lot more to make. In regards to the ceramics, when I wasn't able to have time to go really into kind of the distribution of ceramics throughout the site, right? But what the ceramics tell us about socioeconomic status is utilitarian, fine ceramics, serving wares, painted pots, and vases, or I mean, they were probably more like drinking implements, servingware, that sort of thing, decorated material tells us that that material, those are for upper class. They cost more to make. They often the iconography is imbued with symbolic meaning, kind of esoteric, which has a level of esoteric knowledge that might not be accessible, right, to everyone. Whereas utilitarian ware is used for cooking, water storage, water movement of everyday commodities, would have been used by everyone by necessity. So kind of the distribution of that material, as well as the kind of sophistication and labor input into the architecture, tells us a lot about the socioeconomic status of the people who were in specific locations throughout a city. And it looks like the people who were making this obsidian were of a higher socioeconomic status than most.
Okay. Yeah. And so then that brings up a follow-up question from me, which is just, you had mentioned that some of the objects that you found were maybe used for making textiles or something like that. And so is there then again like class status associated with these different types of artistry, or like, you know, making things that you find evidence of in your trash pits?
Right. So I think that becomes a very loaded question within Mesoamerica, because within the Mesoamerican context, because weaving was very much connotated with the creative power, and specifically the feminine creative power. Like Maya goddess, the Maya goddess Ishil was a weaver, right? So these are important things to keep in mind when we're talking about not only does this have a economic, right, connotation, but it's also like a cosmological one in a sense. In the same
Like
way,
it might not
obsidian,
be money, but it's like a
right,
spiritual power or some other type
right,
of power.
right. And we also can't think, right, that the kind of realms of economy and religion are necessarily separate in the mind of an ancient Mesoamerican person. You know, the economic and kind of cosmological power tied together,
Yeah.
both for obsidian and for weaving. Now, while I think that textiles were likely produced by most households, it may be that like large scale production of uh, textiles was a socioeconomic realm of the elite, or it was something that the elite did
Right.
to boost their own economic strategy. And what I've seen, right, except with the exception of Dump D, the other places that I excavated seem to be domestic settings, and they are certainly not just, making blades. It's not just one thing. They're definitely making textiles. And other scholars have argued that textiles may have been equivalent, right? Essentially bolts of fabric could have been used as a sort of money. Primitive money is the term that people use. But so it could have been like, so many bolts of cloth are equal to so many obsidian blades, which is equal to so many chocolate beans, which is equal to, so many ears of corn. So it's a trade in equivalencies that were that we're talking about. And although not many people have talked about obsidian in this way, I think that it's quite possible that obsidian can be thought of in this way. And the ability to transform it from, you know, raw rock into a blade, which can be then exchanged for whatever, is economic power.
Definitely. Thank you. There are a couple more questions about obsidian. So one person asked what kind of stone is used in the grinding process, and have you ever tried making a blade or other tool like the ones you've uncovered? If so, what was it like and how long did it take?
It's a learning process. So it literally takes years, I would think, to learn how to do it with a high rate of success. I went and learned with one of the masters of kind of replicative archaeological experiments on blade making, and he discusses the way he kind of sees it is that if you are a very good blade maker, once you have a prismatic core, which you have to learn how to make that first, which is no easy task, then you can make blades with about a 10% waste ratio. So you're still going to waste 10% of the material that is just going to go straight into that trash pit. But all the rest of the blades are going to be usable. If you're good, if you're bad, you know, maybe it's 20%, 25%. And basically, if you're operating below that, then you're not useful. But it takes time to get there. I was nowhere near that. I basically only got the blade to release from the core the way I wanted it a few times, and that was with the use of a vise, many errors, and a copper tipped, which Mesoamerican people would not have had one of these, a copper tipped basically crutch that I put into my chest and then used all of my weight to then make the blade pop or release from the core. And I only got it to work a few times. Most of the time, only a little flake came off, and then the master essentially had to come in and fix the core for me. But these would not have you wouldn't have necessarily used another rock. You would have had to use a rock to reduce it down to make the core, which is what we call percussion. Reduction by percussion. But then once you get to a certain point, people would have used either bone or antler or a hard wood and you would have used, then you can use stone first, which we called hard-hammer percussion. Then we use hardwood or bone or antler, which is soft hammer percussion. And then to release the blades and to do the finishing touches on a projectile point, you would then use pressure, which you would just hold the thing in your hand. I'll actually show you a tool.
So I think this is what you were saying was a copper tool that you used when you tried to do it. But you said it was not copper.
Right. So here's my kind of do-it-yourself toolkit. Here is a hard hammer.
Okay.
Here is a antler soft hammer.
Okay.
Here is a hardwood soft hammer. And then here is my cheating tool, which is a copper-tipped little billet.
Okay.
And this would be applied, I would apply this directly to a stone to chip pieces of it off, to sharpen it. And this I would hit directly like this.
Okay.
To knock flakes off of it. So those are the tools you would use. So you would use a kind of an array of tools to make the artifacts that I showed you in this presentation.
Okay, great. Just one more question. I wanted to ask, now that you're coming to the end of your research for your dissertation, where could you see more research being needed? Like, what knowledge gaps would you want to fill if you were going to continue in this research project?
Well, I do plan on kind of continuing it, and basically, I'm working on challenging those notions of how the first how long distance trade, right, and obsidian was organized, because very often, it was on one of the slides I showed you, kind of the three models of procurement, is that most people seem to think that in past societies, that market economies did not exist, although people are challenging that in very important ways these days, and that basically the state or the king, the palace, whatever, however you want to call it, was the institution that controlled all of this, and that economies were essentially redistributive, is that everything went through the palace, and then the palace provisioned the people, and there was and essentially that the palace was controlling everything, which I think is naive, and that every time you try to, every time you test that hypothesis, it's rarely supported. And so my work is basically geared towards combating that stereotype and really getting into the nuts and bolts of, like, okay, who were the agents in that diagram, in the second diagram, the indirect procurement diagram? Who were the merchants, and what are the social networks through which these materials are moving? And in Cotzumalguapa, we seem to have a very kind of intricate, social networks through which this material is moving. And my work has looking at that diachronically on the coast of Guatemala. So looking at how obsidian exchange patterns have fluctuated over time, and whether production is happening on site, or whether people are importing finished materials into their cities.
Okay. Well, that sounds very interesting. I think this brings us to the end of our time for today. I do want to plug, just for everybody in the audience, please follow us on social media. We have a YouTube page, and there's also the mailing list that you can sign up for through the Connect box on the Peabody homepage. We'd love to make sure that everybody knows about these talks so that they can come. And I just want to say thank you again to Dave McCormick for giving this wonderful presentation today. And thank you all for being here.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure. And thanks for everyone for coming.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.